Hi, I'm Evelyn Araluen and I am a poet. So Dropbear is a collection of poetry and prose and a couple of essayistic moments throughout, which are all about exploring my relationship with the different texts, stories and representations that I was raised with as a child. I've spent a lot of time interviewing my parents and interviewing a bit of an older generation of Aboriginal people about what their relationships are with canonical Australian texts such as May Gibbs' Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, Blinky Bill, Dot and the Kangaroo, all of these really impactful texts which we've, I think, got a kind of quite nostalgic relationship about now in Australia, to the point that these images and ideas are often more directly associated with kitsch and Australiana. And I'm pretty interested in the very complex kinds of love and problematics which arise out of those relationships, particularly as an Aboriginal person, as somebody who grew up with responsibilities to country that I was seeing represented or sometimes misrepresented in these texts. So it's a kind of specific theme for the book, and a lot of the poems diverge a little bit, thinking a bit more about my relationship to language and relationship to country and the different people and places which make up my experiences on various stolen lands. But at the end, it's all really coming back to a place of thinking about what it is to love a home, even if that home is changing or misrepresented or in very real ways under environmental and political threat. Mrs. Kookaburra addresses the natives. Humans, please be kind to all bush creatures and don't pull flowers up by the roots. And please be gentle to little ragged blossom of blessed tender heart, loved, beloved by bush and its folk, a wee speck of blushing babe, of lovely, important sadness. We mustn't forget little Abelia, held in guard by thousands of rainbow fish and a charming seaweed estate. She is a shiny white pearl burst open near the pleasant sighs of little ragged blossom who goes oft to visit her in the sea. Humans, you remember how on the killing of the wicked Mrs. Snake, the bush became joyful, and rich Mr. Pilly, the father of Lily Pilly the actress, gave a dinner party at the Gum Inn? Such festive spirits we were in and against as Snugglepot and Cuddlepie held corroboree for the native bears at White City, which the evil, wicked Banksia men call Korrijikup, a foul old word we don't say here. Humans, now tell me, do you really think all the bad Banksia men were deady bones when they went to the bottom of the sea in the great fight with Mr. Lizard and Mr. Eagle and Cuddlepie? Not deady bones, not a bit. For it was just last Cheap Tuesday at Lily Pilly's picture palace that the nasty, dark and dry cones burst terrible into the room, snatching up Nittersing and Narniwas and Jindiwarabak, perhaps in revenge of Mrs. Snake, or her aunt and mother-in-law and 3 cousins, and surely would have gobbled them whole were it not for Mr. Lizard and brave and strong Nuttybub. How blessed we are in this delightful bush, which lends its dappled light to our important tales, so that we might share with our little nuts. How frightened we were of those straggly, godless fiends. What fun it was to see their eyes plucked out by those fearsome red-tailed cooks that they called the foul old word we don't say here. I think most writers, there's a really long genesis before anything that we put pen to paper on can really actually take a recognisable shape. I've been thinking about different ideas and stories and poems and fragments that went into this collection for probably about 5 years, really like as long as I've been writing poetry. But the process of going from just a broad collection or an idea of like a broad assortment of whatever I've been writing towards a more conceptual work like Dropbear was actually, I think, a lot of a lot of that was really down to collaboration and support throughout the rest of the Aboriginal writing community, talking to writers like Alison Whittaker, and then the mentorship with Tony Birch through the Wheeler Centre's Next Chapter scheme. All of these different things really kind of reaffirmed to me that I just don't think that writing should be a solitary act. I think we really do have a community, a very rich and supportive community behind a good deal of Australian publishing, and particularly Australian poetry publishing. So, I had poems, I had fragments, I had ideas that were sitting around for a long time, but it was that conversation, guidance and support from other writers, from my editor, Ellen Van Neven, and then, the process with UQP about starting to think about arrangement and design and all of these things. It was a couple of years of work, but it hopefully means that this book can speak to more than just my own very specific experiences. It can speak to a lot of other Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people living in settler colonial Australia and trying to process these images and representations that we've all been raised with or raised against in some way. I'm not really sure at what point writing became a thing that I felt like I could legitimately do, even, not even contemplating the economic reality of writing as a career, because it's not necessarily the best paid industry. I loved writing and literature and the idea of authorship from a really young age. I was very lucky to be raised by parents who, while they hadn't grown up in contexts of literacy, they were really actively trying to give us access to books, to literature, and to an appreciation for storytelling. But at some point I went from writing as a pastime, literally just writing the sort of self-insert stories that I wanted. I was trying to articulate my own desires for life through, and then shifting that into some kind of legitimate practice. I started writing poetry actually because I was in a relationship with a poet and he wrote me a poem, and I was like, oh, I reckon I could do that. So it's a really it's not a great origin story. It wasn't really until I actually started learning Bundjalung, which is my great-grandfather's language, that something did change in my head about grammar and syntax, and that it was like a light bulb when I could understand language in a more abstract and disembodied way, a slightly more distanced way, that meant that I could find my own voice in that. So it's all just been a really weird arrangement of luck and proximity and different things that I've done for myself that has led to me becoming a writer. But it feels really, it still feels incredibly fragile, and one day somebody's going to turn around and be like, oh, I've read your book. I don't think it's a book. I don't think any of these are poems. You never learnt how to write poetry, and therefore you have to go to poetry school and do everything right, or else we'll kick you out of the poetry club. So I'm waiting for that to happen. It will one day. I'll just wake up to an email and I'll be out of poetry or something like that. I don't know if anyone's a full-time writer. I'm not a full-time writer. I work for Overland Literary Journal a couple of days a week, but actually work most days of the week there because the arts is a really underfunded industry, and we spend so much time trying to build up the financial and political, cultural stability to have this be a survivable industry. I'm also still technically a student, so I kind of flick between writing as research, writing as my day job, writing as a creative practice, and I'm still, I think, just on the cusp of actually ever getting that sense of legitimacy and that kind of financial security to even put aside a day of week and dedicate that to writing. So I'm hoping that that's my next stage, and that will also include time to read more and time to research more. I think a good writing practice is one that is probably about 50% reading, and until that is a stability that I feel like I have access to, I'm still really hesitant about calling myself a writer, because I can't fully participate in the community and in all of the creative and intellectual energy that needs to go into a strong and a communal writing practice. 2020 was weird. I moved to Melbourne very about 2 or 3 weeks before the restrictions came into place, so I was still unpacking. We didn't have enough furniture to fill our new house. I didn't have a desk, I think, until probably about April. So writing was hard to, it was actually hard to find a kind of physical place in unpacked boxes to set aside the kind of comfort that you need for writing. And when I'm writing creatively, like, I can only ever do it in the extremes of like jotting down notes on my phone when I'm on a tram or something like that, or if I've got like a nice cozy little corner of a house all set up with a cup of tea and stuff. So it took me a really long time to get that, and I found time in the weird solitude of lockdown to try to get some self-reflection going that wasn't just incredibly morbid contemplation of the global situation. But it was an entirely changed practice for me on that basis, and I think a lot of writers are in a similar situation, where I think just something about our mindset and our praxis is changed forever. A lot of us, I think, idealised the notion that we would have some excuse to stay inside and write all day, and when we actually got what we wanted, we realised that it's not all it's cracked up to be. I would say I probably had 2 books that I really enjoyed for very different reasons during 2020, and that's, I read a lot of poetry last year, and I loved a lot of poetry that came out last year, books that were written just before the pandemic. So I'm very excited to see how 2021 and 2022 are going to go in poetry. But my real love, I think, of last year's publications was Ellen Van Nieven's Throat, which was published with the University of Queensland Press. It was a very different collection to Ellen's previous one, Comfort Food, but it was very bold and provocative, and it was something that took me out of the space of 2020 in a political and a conceptual way. But then one book that I just really loved to sink into was Susanna Clarke's Piranesi, and I loved her work, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, her short stories. I loved those things, and so when Piranesi came out, I had literally no time to read anything that wasn't work related, so I downloaded it as an ebook, which I hate doing. I think Amazon's evil, but the experience of having somebody read to me while I'm at the dog park, just staring at the same creature that I stare at home all day, it was a great story. I'm so glad that it came out last year. I don't think we would have held on as a society if she'd made us wait for another year for that one. I think, like a lot of people in my generation, I had an idealised response to my relationship with literature because of J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter series. And on reflection, I realised that Harry Potter never got me to become interested in reading. Harry Potter got me to read Harry Potter, and it got me to obsessively reread Harry Potter, which is actually not a healthy reading practice. So I don't actually now look back on those texts, those books, with the kind of fondness that I thought that I would in the future. Other series like, a series of unfortunate events from Lemony Snicket, that was much more powerful for me because they were darker and more provocative ideas. But I think the the main shift for me going from like being a young adult and reading young adult stories or reading children's stories to my first real like literary loves was Michael Ondaatje and books like The English Patient, Divisadero, and Neil's Ghost. Those were books that like pushed my reading into a place that wasn't just projected by pure entertainment and how much I could sink into a book, which we always love this idea of sinking into something. Those books gave me like an appreciation for language that was just one of the most transformative experiences that I've ever had. So, you know, I love all those books from when I was a kid, or I have complex relationships with them. So complex that I wrote my book about them. But yeah, Michael Ondaatje and literary fiction did sort of change my world in quite a really profound way. I'm in the process of working on a novel, actually, which is probably not what anyone would have thought at that stage. But yeah, I'm working on a project that would allow me to interview and speak with a lot of women in Australian literature and the history of Australian publishing to talk about their experiences of structural and institutional sexism and racism, because I think that has had a very profound impact on the kinds of literature and stories that we have available now, but also the stories that never made it through the industry. And that might be, you know, as recently as a few years ago, but also we're missing so many stories from 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago in Australia that I would really love to see some kind of recognition of. So I'm exploring what a dual creative and research-based practice might look like in trying to engage with and encounter some of those stories that are not in our canon or in our archive. Thank you so much for having me.